On the morning of August 21, 1942, Colonel Ichiki sat in the darkness of the Guadalcanal jungle and finalized his plan to sweep the Americans into the sea. His elite detachment, 917 men who had trained for the invasion of Midway, would attack at night. They would overwhelm the defenders with speed and ferocity. The enemy garrison, Japanese intelligence had assured him, numbered perhaps 2,000 men. They were soft Americans, untested in battle. Ichiki had served in the Imperial Japanese Army for decades. He had fought in Manchuria. He had commanded troops in combat. He knew war. This would be finished by dawn. But the men Ichiki planned to destroy were not the soft garrison troops he expected. They were United States Marines, products of a training system and a warrior culture that Japanese military intelligence had completely and utterly failed to understand. The actual American force on Guadalcanal exceeded 11,000 men, and they were waiting. Ichiki was about to discover what Japanese commanders across the Pacific would learn at tremendous cost over the next 3 brutal years. Fighting American Marines was different, and that difference would haunt the Imperial Japanese Army from the Solomon Islands to Iwo Jima. The Japanese military entered World War II with deeply ingrained beliefs about Western fighting capability. Captain Toshikazu Omae of the Imperial Japanese Navy later wrote that an illusion began to prevail among the Japanese Army and Navy from the top down, the illusion that the United States and Great Britain were not worth being afraid of. The caution heretofore exercised in operational policies suddenly disappeared. Japanese military planners assumed that individualistic, materialistic Westerners could not match Japanese spiritual resolve in ground combat. This assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. The intelligence apparatus that fed this delusion was woefully inadequate. Japan's Army Intelligence Section entered the war with just 20 officers and 20 enlisted men, and their focus was almost entirely on the Soviet Union. They had virtually no capacity to assess American ground forces. A Japanese journalist recorded in 1943 that Japan was totally incapable of standing apart objectively and viewing positively the emotions and thought patterns of other countries. When Marines landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, Imperial General Headquarters estimated their strength at approximately 2,000 men. They considered the landing inconceivable as anything more than a reconnaissance raid. The actual Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal at the time of the landing numbered roughly 2,800 personnel, but approximately 2,200 of these were Korean forced laborers brought to construct an airfield. Only about 600 were actual Japanese combat troops. The Japanese had been building what would become Henderson Field, not preparing a fortress. They scattered into the jungle when the Marines came ashore. Within 48 hours, the Marines had captured the airfield and renamed it after Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed leading his squadron against Japanese carriers at the Battle of Midway. Tokyo responded with contempt disguised as strategy. Colonel Ichiki received orders to retake the airfield with his detachment. Japanese commanders reportedly dismissed the American defenders as haughty, effeminate, and cowardly. This attitude shaped the tactical plan. Ichiki would attack immediately, with his first echelon of 917 men, rather than wait for the second echelon still en route. Speed and aggression would compensate for numbers. The soft Americans would break and run. In the early hours of August 21, Ichiki's men charged across the sandbar at the mouth of Alligator Creek, which American maps mistakenly labeled the Tenaru River. They ran directly into interlocking fields of machine gun fire from Marines of the 1st Marine Division who had been warned of their approach by native scouts. The slaughter was immediate and overwhelming. Marines poured rifle and machine gun fire into the Japanese ranks as they struggled across the narrow sandbar. bodies piled on bodies. Men who made it across found no cover, only more guns. When dawn broke, artillery and tanks joined the massacre. Grumman Wildcat fighters from Henderson Field strafed the survivors trapped on the sandbar. By afternoon, between 770 and 800 of Ichiki's 917 men lay dead. The Marines lost 43 killed. Colonel Ichiki burned his regimental colours, the sacred symbol of his unit's honour, and took his own life. The survivors who straggled back to Japanese lines brought word of a disaster that headquarters at Rabaul initially refused to believe. The reports could not be accurate. American troops could not have inflicted such losses on Japanese soldiers. There must be some mistake. Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka later described the assault as like a housefly attacking a giant tortoise. The odds were all against it. Most of our men met violent death assaulting the enemy lines, but Japanese commanders drew precisely the wrong lesson from the catastrophe. They blamed Ichiki's rashness, rather than questioning their fundamental assumptions about American fighting capability. They sent more men, who met similar fates. The pattern established at Alligator Creek repeated across Guadalcanal with mounting Japanese losses. In September 1942, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi led his 35th Infantry Brigade, approximately 3,000 men, against a ridge south of Henderson Field defended by 840 Marines. The defenders were the 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, a leathery veteran who had earned his reputation fighting bandits in Nicaragua during the Banana Wars. His men called him Red Mike for the color of his beard. The Japanese called the ridge Mukadegata, the centipede, for its shape. For 2 nights, waves of Japanese infantry surged up what would become known as Edson's Ridge or Bloody Ridge. The fighting was medieval in its savagery. Marines fought with bayonets, entrenching tools and pistols when rifles ran dry. Edson rallied his exhausted men from atop a grenade box as hand-to-hand fighting raged across the position. At one point he reportedly called out, "You men have done a great job so far, but I have one more thing to ask of you." When the Japanese finally withdrew on September 14th, between 700 and 850 of Kawaguchi's men lay dead on the ridge. Total Japanese casualties for the attack exceeded 1,500. Marine losses were 59 killed and 204 wounded. Both Edson and Captain Kenneth Bailey received the Medal of Honor for their leadership that night. 19 Navy Crosses were awarded. The heaviest blow came in October. Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama led his 2nd Sendai Infantry Division, approximately 7,000 men, in the largest Japanese ground assault of the campaign. These were not second-rate troops. The Sendai Division was one of Japan's elite units, veterans of the conquest of Java. They hacked through miles of jungle to approach Henderson Field from an unexpected direction, dragging artillery pieces by hand through terrain that seemed impassable. On the night of October 24th, waves of Japanese soldiers threw themselves against Marine positions around the airfield. The fighting reached its climax in the sector held by Sergeant John Basilone and his machine gun sections of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. Basilone was a 25-year-old from Raritan, New Jersey, who had enlisted in the Marines after a stint in the Army. He had no special privileges, no extraordinary background. He was simply a Marine sergeant doing his job. That night, his job required him to perform acts that would become legendary. When one of his machine gun sections was destroyed, Basilone moved an extra gun into position. When ammunition ran low, he fought his way through Japanese infiltrators to bring up more belts. When his guns jammed in the tropical humidity, he repaired them under fire, burning his hands on the overheated barrels. When the ammunition ran out entirely, he fought with his pistol and machete. His Medal of Honor citation records that he contributed in large measure to the virtual annihilation of a Japanese regiment. A body count detail tallied over 1,400 Japanese dead across the battlefield the next morning. Only Basilone and 2 other men from his original section survived the night. A Japanese major who survived the assault committed suicide, leaving a note that read, "I do not know what excuse to give. I apologize for what I have done. I am going to return my borrowed life today with short interest." General Maruyama, informed that his 29th Regiment had been annihilated, said simply, "That is it." By December 1942, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were starving. Their supply lines had been cut by American naval and air forces that controlled the waters around the island by day. Destroyers running the slot at night could not bring enough food for the growing garrison. Malaria ravaged both sides, but the Japanese lacked quinine and medical supplies. Men ate grass, roots, and leather from their equipment. They ate the flesh of dead comrades and enemies. A Japanese lieutenant recorded a grim scale in his diary. "He who can rise to his feet has 30 days left to live. He who can sit up has 20 days. He who must urinate while lying down has 3 days. He who cannot speak has 2 days. He who cannot blink his eyes will be dead at dawn." The Japanese called Guadalcanal the Island of Death. Tokyo made the decision to evacuate in January 1943, secretly withdrawing the survivors under cover of darkness in a brilliant operation the Americans did not detect until it was complete. The final toll was devastating for Japan. Approximately 14,800 Japanese soldiers died in combat on Guadalcanal. Another 9,000 perished from disease and starvation. Total Japanese dead exceeded 23,000. American ground forces lost 1,500, 92 killed. The naval battles surrounding the island cost both sides heavily, with over 5,000 American sailors killed in the surrounding waters in engagements like the Battle of Savo Island and the naval Battle of Guadalcanal. But the strategic verdict was clear. Japan had suffered its first decisive ground defeat of the war. The myth of Japanese invincibility on land had been shattered. Major General Kawaguchi later called Guadalcanal the graveyard of the Japanese army. A captured Japanese bomber pilot on Guadalcanal, who claimed to have graduated from Ohio State University, told war correspondent Ira Wolfert a line that became famous among the Marines. "Your Marines seem to be fighting for souvenirs." The remark captured something essential about the Marines' aggressive spirit, the way they pressed forward even when defense might have been easier. What made the Marines different from the opponent's Japanese forces had faced in China and Southeast Asia? The answer begins with how Marines were made. The United States Marine Corps that fought in the Pacific had been shaped by 2 decades of doctrinal innovation and a training philosophy that prized marksmanship, aggression, and institutional identity above everything else. The differences from Army training were both quantitative and psychological. Marine boot camp during World War II typically lasted 7 to 8 weeks by mid-war, though the duration fluctuated as the Corps expanded. In 1939, when manpower authorizations increased after the Nazi invasion of Poland, boot camp was temporarily reduced to just 4 weeks to accelerate throughput. By 1942, it had increased to 7 weeks, and by 1944, a comprehensive 16-week program combined 8 weeks of basic training with 8 weeks of advanced field instruction. But duration told only part of the story. The Marine schedule was far more weapons-intensive than Army basic training. Nearly half of all training hours, between 43 and 46%, depending on the depot, were devoted to weapons instruction. Marines spent over 140 hours on the rifle range alone. They qualified at 200, 300, and 500 yards firing with iron sights at distances that tested the limits of human marksmanship. Those who failed to qualify were recycled through training again. There was no graduation without passing the range. Every Marine, the Corps believed, was first and foremost a rifleman. The deeper difference was psychological. Marine drill instructors systematically stripped away civilian identity through shared hardship, relentless discipline, and constant reinforcement of Marine Corps history and mythology. The goal was to replace individual identity with institutional identity. A man ceased to be a civilian and became a Marine, bound to every Marine who had served before him and every Marine who would serve after. The process was deliberately brutal. William Manchester, who served as a Marine in the Pacific, recalled seeing drill instructors bloody recruits' noses at Paris Island in spring 1942. This was considered acceptable practice at the time. General William Rupertus captured this philosophy in the Rifleman's Creed, first published in March 1942 in the San Diego Marine Corps Chevron. Rupertus believed Marines needed to understand that the only weapon which stands between them and death is the rifle. They must understand that their rifle is their life. Every recruit memorized the creed. My rifle is my best friend. It is my life. I must master it as I must master my life. Without me, my rifle is useless. Without my rifle, I am useless. This was not mere indoctrination. The Marines built their training around a simple tactical reality. In the close terrain of Pacific Island warfare, individual marksmanship and small unit aggressiveness would matter more than massed firepower or elaborate maneuver. Every Marine, regardless of his specialty, had to be able to fight as an infantryman. The cooks, the clerks, the truck drivers all received the same weapons training as the riflemen. This philosophy would prove its worth when Japanese infiltrators turned every battle into a 360-degree fight. Lieutenant Stephen Stavers articulated the purpose of bayonet training in the Marine Corps Gazette in 1943. A commander can hardly expect a real offensive spirit or an unhesitant assault if most of his men, lacking faith in their hand-to-hand combat effectiveness, feel more secure the farther they are from the enemy. The 17 to 19 hours of bayonet instruction in Marine training were not primarily about producing bayonet kills. They were about manufacturing aggression. But the Marines possessed advantages beyond training. They had spent 20 years preparing for exactly the kind of war they would fight in the Pacific. In 1921, a brilliant and eccentric Marine officer named Earl Ellis produced a document that would shape American strategy for a war still 20 years in the future. Operation Plan 712, titled Advanced Base Operations in Micronesia, predicted that Japan would initiate war against the United States, likely with a strike against Hawaii. Ellis then mapped out an American counter-offensive that would advance through the Marshall Islands, the Caroline Islands, and the Palau Islands, seizing Japanese-held atolls one by one until American forces could strike at the Japanese home islands. The plan was audacious, detailed, and remarkably prescient. The actual island-hopping campaign of World War II followed Ellis's proposed route almost exactly, differing only in the addition of the Gilbert Islands to the itinerary. Commandant Major General John Lejeune approved the plan on July 23, 1921. Ellis died mysteriously in the Palau Islands 2 years later during a clandestine intelligence mission, but his vision shaped Marine Corps planning for the next 2 decades. On December 7, 1933, exactly 8 years before Pearl Harbor, Secretary of the Navy Claude Swanson signed General Order No. 241, creating the Fleet Marine Force. This placed Marines under the operational control of the Fleet Commander as an integral unit of the combatant sea establishment. The Marines would specialize in seizing advanced bases for the Navy, conducting the amphibious assaults that would carry American power across the Pacific. Initial Fleet Marine Force strength was only approximately 3,000 officers and men, but the organizational framework was revolutionary. For the first time, a nation had created a permanent force specifically trained and equipped for amphibious operations. The British had conducted amphibious assaults throughout their history, but never with a dedicated force that practiced the art continuously. The Marines then produced the doctrinal manual that would make such assaults possible. In November 1933, all classes at the Marine Corps schools in Quantico were suspended. Every instructor and student turned their attention to a single task. Faculty and students worked together under Colonel Ellis Miller to produce the tentative manual for landing operations, completing it in January 1934. This document was the world's first detailed codification of amphibious assault doctrine. It covered command relationships, naval gunfire support, air support, ship-to-shore movement, and logistics. The manual addressed problems that had plagued amphibious operations throughout history, from the British disaster at Gallipoli in 1915 to smaller failures in colonial campaigns. The Navy adopted it as Fleet Training Publication 167 in 1938. The Army derived its own manual from it. The doctrine that carried Allied troops ashore at Normandy on D-Day was fundamentally of Marine Corps origin. The Marines also pioneered the specialized equipment that made amphibious assault practical. The Higgins Boat, officially designated the landing craft vehicle personnel, evolved from Andrew Higgins's 1926 design for a shallow draft boat that could navigate Louisiana swamps. Marines tested it extensively, added a bow ramp that allowed troops to exit directly onto beaches rather than climbing over the sides, and championed its adoption. Over 23,000 were produced during the war by Higgins Industries and other manufacturers. General Eisenhower later said that Andrew Higgins was the man who won the war for us, because without his landing craft, the Allies could never have landed over an open beach, and the whole strategy of the war would have been different. The amphibious tractor proved equally crucial. Donald Roebling designed the original vehicle in 1935 as a rescue craft for the Everglades, intended to reach people stranded in hurricanes and floods. A 1937 Life magazine article caught Marine interest, and Marines ordered 300 in 1940. The tracked amphibian could crawl over coral reefs that would stop conventional landing craft, a capability that would save countless lives in the assaults to come. At Tarawa, the amphibious tractors were the only vehicles that could cross the reef when the tide failed to rise as predicted. Without them, the landing might have failed entirely. Marine aviation developed alongside amphibious doctrine to provide close air support that ground troops could actually rely upon. During the Banana Wars in Haiti and Nicaragua, Marine pilots had developed techniques for supporting infantry in contact with the enemy, delivering ordnance within hundreds of yards of friendly troops. This required coordination systems that did not exist in other services. By World War II, Marines deployed air liaison parties directly with frontline units, officers and radio men who could talk directly to pilots overhead and direct their fire onto specific targets. At Okinawa, 34 Marine squadrons provided close air support, dropping bombs and napalm on Japanese positions, sometimes only 50 yards from Marine infantry. The catastrophe at Tarawa in November 1943 demonstrated both the brutal learning curve of amphibious warfare and the determination that defined Marine combat. Betio Island, the objective of Operation Galvanic, measured roughly 2 miles long and 800 yards at its widest point. It was smaller than the average American municipal airport. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki had transformed this tiny spit of coral into a fortress, defended by approximately 2,600 trained combat troops, plus construction personnel and Korean laborers, totaling roughly 4,800 men. 14 coastal defense guns, some taken from British positions at Singapore, over 100 machine gun nests, and 500 pillboxes covered every approach. The assault began on November 20th, 1943. A miscalculation about tidal conditions left only 3 feet of water over the reef surrounding the island, far too shallow for the Higgins boats. Marines in the landing craft ran aground 500 to 700 yards from shore. They had to wade through chest-deep water under murderous fire from positions they could not suppress. A naval observer described the scene. The water seemed never clear of tiny men. They kept falling, 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 singly, in groups and in rows. Only the amphibious tractors could cross the reef. These thin-skinned vehicles, never designed for assault against fortified positions, became lifelines. Marines crowded aboard and rowed them directly onto the beach, taking horrific casualties but establishing footholds that infantry wading behind them could reinforce. Many tractors were destroyed, their burning hulks littering the shallows. Colonel David Shoup, commanding the assault on the beach, was wounded but refused evacuation. His radio message to the fleet became legendary. Casualties many, percentage dead unknown, combat efficiency we are winning. For 76 hours, Marines fought from shell hole to shell hole, reducing each Japanese position with grenades, flamethrowers, and point-blank rifle fire. There was no front line. There was no rear area. Every yard of Betio was contested. The sole surviving Japanese officer, Warrant Officer Kiyoshi Ota, later described watching the American landing craft approach. We could see them coming towards us, like dozens of spiders over the surface of the water. One of my men exclaimed, "The god of death has come." When the fighting ended, over 1,000 Marines lay dead. More than 2,000 more were wounded. The toll represented roughly 1/3 of the landing force killed or wounded in just 76 hours. Of Shibazaki's garrison, only 17 Japanese soldiers and 129 Korean laborers survived to be captured. 4 medals of honor were awarded, 3 of them posthumously. Tarawa shocked the American public with its casualty photographs, the first uncensored images of dead Americans to be released during the war. But it taught the Marines lessons about naval gunfire, reef reconnaissance, and amphibious tractor employment that would save lives in the assaults to come. The battles that followed demonstrated Japanese forces adapting their tactics, while Marines relentlessly improved their methods. At Peleliu in September 1944, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa abandoned the beach defense and banzai charge tactics that had failed at Guadalcanal and Tarawa. Instead, he built his defense around approximately 500 limestone caves in the Umurbrogel ridges, connected by tunnels and equipped with electric lights, ventilation systems, and sliding armored steel doors. His men would not throw away their lives in futile charges. They would make the Americans pay for every yard. Major General William Rupertus, author of The Rifleman's Creed, predicted a quick victory at Peleliu, perhaps 3 or 4 days of hard fighting. The battle lasted 73 days. Louis Chesty Puller, now a colonel commanding the 1st Marine Regiment, led his men into the ridges that became known as Bloody Nose. The terrain was nightmarish, a jumbled mass of coral pinnacles and sinkholes where visibility dropped to yards and every shadow might conceal a cave mouth. His regiment suffered 1,749 casualties, a rate approaching 60%, among the highest regimental losses in Marine Corps history. One sergeant who survived later said, "This ain't a regiment, we're just survivors." Nakagawa fought until his garrison was annihilated. His final message to Tokyo read, "Our sword is broken and we have run out of spears." He burned his regimental colors, transmitted the word Sakura, cherry blossom, signifying that it had ended, and committed ritual suicide on November 24th. He was posthumously promoted to lieutenant general. Total American losses at Peleliu exceeded 1,700 dead and nearly 7,000 wounded. Approximately 10,700 Japanese died defending the island. The lessons of Peleliu shaped the defense of Iwo Jima, and the general who commanded that defense understood his enemy better than any Japanese commander of the war. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had served as deputy military attaché in Washington during the 1920s. He had taken courses at Harvard University, received cavalry training at Fort Bliss, Texas, and traveled extensively across the United States. He understood American industrial capacity and American determination in ways that other Japanese officers did not. He wrote to his wife that the United States is the last country in the world Japan should fight. Its industrial potential is huge and fabulous, and the people are energetic and versatile. One must never underestimate the American fighting ability. Kuribayashi knew he could not hold Iwo Jima. He knew the Americans would eventually take it. His goal was to make them pay such a terrible price that they might reconsider invading Japan itself. He transformed Iwo Jima into the most heavily fortified position in the Pacific. His engineers completed 18 kilometers of tunnels before the American assault began, with over 1,500 underground rooms connected in a defensive network designed to absorb bombardment and channel attackers into kill zones. Mount Suribachi alone contained a tunnel system 7 levels deep. Artillery and mortar positions were pre-registered on every possible landing beach. Every yard of the island was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Kuribayashi strictly forbade the banzai charges that had wasted Japanese manpower at Guadalcanal and elsewhere. His orders were explicit. "We shall not die until we have killed 10 of the enemy. Every man will resist until the end, making his position his tomb. No man shall infiltrate the enemy. No man shall expect to return alive." The Marines who landed on February 19, 1945, knew they faced a desperate enemy in fortified terrain, but even veterans of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Peleliu were unprepared for what awaited them. Kuribayashi let the first waves land unopposed, allowing thousands of Marines to mass on the beaches. Then his guns opened fire from pre-registered positions that covered every inch of the landing zones. The 3rd Battalion, 25th Marines, landed approximately 900 men that morning on the extreme right flank near a feature called the Quarry. By nightfall, only 150 remained in fighting condition, an 83% casualty rate in a single day. Across the island, the story was similar. Marines could not dig foxholes in the volcanic ash that collapsed as fast as they could shovel. There was no cover from the interlocking fields of fire. They could only advance yard by yard, reducing each cave and bunker with the tactics they had learned at terrible cost. Captain Fred Haynes later recalled that the Japanese were not on Iwo Jima, they were in it. Among the Marines who landed that morning was Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, the hero of Guadalcanal, who had received the Medal of Honor for his actions at Henderson Field. Basilone had refused a commission and a desk job to return to combat. He told interviewers that he was no officer and no museum piece. He belonged with his Marines. He landed on Red Beach 2 and immediately began leading his men forward, destroying a Japanese blockhouse and guiding a tank through a minefield. Approximately 90 minutes after landing, he was killed by a mortar burst. He was 28 years old. Basilone became the only enlisted Marine in World War II to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross, the latter awarded posthumously for his actions on Iwo Jima. His wife, Lina Riggi Basilone, also a Marine sergeant, received his Navy Cross at Camp Pendleton. The battle for Iwo Jima lasted 36 days. It was the only Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties. 6,821 Marines and sailors died. More than 19,000 were wounded. The casualty rate for the three Marine divisions exceeded 100% of their original rifle strength when replacements were factored in. Of Kuribayashi's garrison of approximately 21,000 men, only 216 were captured. The rest died in the tunnels and bunkers they had sworn to defend. Kuribayashi himself likely died, leading a final attack on March 26th, though his body was never positively identified. The iconic photograph of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi, captured by Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal on February 23rd, became the most reproduced image in the history of photography. It depicted 6 men raising a replacement flag, larger than the first flag raised earlier that day. 3 of the 6 men in the photograph would be killed before the battle ended. The image was not staged, though Rosenthal also took a posed photograph afterward that led to later confusion. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, watching the flag go up from a ship offshore, reportedly said that the raising of that flag means a Marine Corps for the next 500 years. Fleet Admiral Chesty Nimitz issued Communique No. 300 on March 16, 1945. Among the Americans serving on Iwo Island, uncommon valor was a common virtue. 27 medals of honor were awarded for Iwo Jima, the most in any single battle in American history. 14 of the recipients received their medals posthumously. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, the Marine commander, assessed his Japanese counterpart with grudging respect. I do not know who he is, but the Japanese general running this show is one smart bastard. After the war, Smith called Kuribayashi the most redoubtable of all Japanese adversaries. The tactical cost was staggering, but the strategic result was clear. American bombers now had emergency landing strips within fighter escort range of Japan. Over 24,000 airmen would make emergency landings on Iwo Jima before the war ended, many of them in damaged B-29 bombers that could never have reached other bases. Okinawa, the final major battle of the Pacific War, brought Marines and Army troops together against the largest Japanese garrison they would face. General Mitsuru Ushijima's 32nd Army numbered approximately 100,000 regular troops, defending from an estimated 60 miles of interconnected cave passages and fortified positions centered on the Shuri defensive line. Unlike previous island battles, Okinawa was a major landmass with a civilian population of several 100,000. The battle began on April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, and raged for nearly 3 months. The initial landings were almost unopposed. Ushijima had learned from Kuribayashi's example at Iwo Jima and concentrated his forces in the southern part of the island, daring the Americans to come to him. The Marines and Army divisions advanced quickly at first, then slammed into the Shuri line, a defensive belt that stretched across the island's narrow waist. Here the fighting became a grinding war of attrition. The 6th Marine Division assaulted a position called Sugarloaf Hill 11 times in a single week. The hill dominated the approaches to the city of Naha and anchored the western flank of the Shuri defensive line. It rose only about 50 feet above the surrounding terrain, but its interlocking defenses with 2 adjacent hills, Half Moon and Horseshoe, created a triangular killing ground that swallowed companies whole. Any unit that took Sugarloaf found itself under fire from the other 2 hills. Any unit that retreated exposed itself to fire from positions it had just captured. 2,662 Marines were killed or wounded taking Sugarloaf. Another 1,289 suffered psychiatric casualties, men whose minds broke under the unrelenting horror of the fighting. One company commander recalled that the weights of the names in those casualty reports were heavy beyond measure. Japanese soldier Hajime Kondo later recalled his first sight of the Americans. When I saw them for the first time, the tank and the infantry companies, they were chewing gum. They looked as though they were coming on a picnic. But he soon discovered that these Americans would fight fiercely. The Japanese called the battle Tetsu no Bofu, Typhoon of Steel. Both commanding generals died on Okinawa. Lieutenant General Simon Believer Buckner, the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire in World War II, was struck by Japanese artillery on June 18th while observing operations near the front lines. General Ushijima committed ritual suicide on June 22nd, along with his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho. Total casualties were staggering. Over 12,500 Americans died. Approximately 110,000 Japanese soldiers were killed. Okinawan civilian casualties remain disputed, but estimates range from 40,000 to over 150,000 dead. Many caught in the crossfire or driven to suicide by Japanese propaganda. The tactical innovations that gave Marines their edge evolved throughout the war, each refinement paid for in blood. The four-man fire team, developed by officers like Merritt Edson and Evans Carlson during the Banana Wars in Nicaragua, became the basic building block of Marine infantry. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Instead of maneuvering an entire squad as a single unit, Marines could break into three smaller elements that could independently suppress, maneuver, and assault. By May 1944, the Marine Corps standardized a 13-man rifle squad consisting of one squad leader and three four-man fire teams, each equipped with a Browning automatic rifle. This gave Marine squads three automatic weapons and three independently maneuverable elements, significantly more firepower and flexibility than the Army's organization. One fire team could suppress the enemy while a second maneuvered to flank, with a third in reserve. This structure remained standard for over 75 years. Against the cave defenses that Japanese forces perfected after Tarawa, Marines developed what they called the corkscrew and blowtorch method. The approach was methodical and brutal. Sherman tanks cracked open bunkers with 75mm fire, while riflemen suppressed defenders. Flamethrowers, both portable and tank-mounted, drenched cave interiors with burning napalm. The portable M2 flamethrower had a range of only about 40 yards, requiring extraordinary courage from the Marines who wielded them. Demolition teams sealed entrances with satchel charges, entombing any survivors. Marine divisions dramatically increased their flamethrower allocation as the war progressed, from 24 in early war divisions to 243 in the 1944 organization. The increase reflected the growing recognition that conventional weapons were often useless against determined defenders in fortified caves. At Iwo Jima, flamethrower tanks called Zippos dispensed thousands of gallons of napalm daily over the 36-day campaign. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was profound. Men who had sworn to die fighting often chose suicide over the horror of being burned alive. One Marine captain stated that the flame tank, more than any other supporting arm, won this battle. The men who embodied Marine fighting spirit became legends, whose names recruits still invoke today. Louis Chesty Puller earned 5 Navy Crosses across his career, 2 in Nicaragua, 1 at Guadalcanal, 1 at Cape Gloucester, and 1 at the Chosin Reservoir in Korea. He remains the most decorated Marine in history. At Peleliu, Sergeant George Petto encountered the exhausted colonel during the fighting for Bloody Nose Ridge. "Hi, son," Puller greeted him. Petto later said that encounter did more for my well-being than a good drink of cool water, which I was in bad need of. I would have followed that man to hell and that is exactly what we did at Peleliu. The Marine Raiders activated in February 1942 as the Corps' commando force, established a legendary combat record before being disbanded in January 1944. Edson's first raiders defended Bloody Ridge. Carlson's second raiders conducted the Makin Island submarine raid in August 1942, the first American offensive ground action of the war, and the famous long patrol behind Japanese lines on Guadalcanal, a 29-day, 150-mile odyssey that killed over 500 enemy soldiers while losing only 16 men. Carlson adopted the Chinese phrase gung-ho, which he took from the Chinese industrial cooperatives, as his battalion motto. The phrase entered the English language through his Marines. The Navajo code talkers provided an unbreakable communications system throughout the Pacific Campaign. Approximately 400 Navajos served as code talkers in all 6 Marine divisions. At Iwo Jima, Major Howard Connor employed 6 code talkers around the clock during the first 48 hours, sending and receiving over 800 messages without a single error. Connor later stated that without the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. Lieutenant General Seizo Arisue, Japanese Chief of Intelligence, confirmed after the war that while Japan could break American Army and Army Air Corps codes, they never cracked the Marine code based on the Navajo language. The question remains whether Japanese forces actually hated or feared fighting Marines more than other American units. The honest historical answer is more nuanced than legend suggests. Japanese military intelligence was catastrophically inadequate across all fronts. They underestimated all American forces, not Marines specifically. No systematic Japanese comparison of Marine versus Army fighting quality has been recovered from wartime documents. The intelligence apparatus that failed so completely before Guadalcanal never truly recovered its credibility or its competence. What is documented is that Marines fought the most iconic and brutal island assault battles of the Pacific War. The campaigns from Guadalcanal through Okinawa were overwhelmingly Marine operations. Army divisions fought alongside Marines at Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, and Okinawa, often with equal valor. But the narrative that emerged from the war emphasized the Marine role, and the Japanese soldiers who faced these assaults left testimonies of shock at American ferocity. This reflected the nature of the battles, rather than a systematic assessment of different American services. Historian M.G. Sheftel captured the significance. What was most shocking for the Japanese, beyond the strategic significance of the defeat, was the destruction of the myth that when they finally got the chance to meet the Americans in large numbers, in open battle, in ground combat, that the individualistic materialist Westerners were just going to fold up. When they found out the Americans could fight just as fiercely as the Japanese could, although in a very different way, it was a shock to them, and I am not sure they ever recovered. The Marines comprised only 5% of American armed forces during World War II, yet they suffered 10% of American battle casualties. This statistical reality reflects the ferocity of the island campaign that the Marines were assigned to fight. Whether Japanese soldiers specifically feared Marines more than Army troops matters less than the fact that Marines accomplished the missions they were given at tremendous cost, with a determination that their enemies could not break. The Marines who stormed the beaches of the Pacific are mostly gone now. The youngest veterans of Iwo Jima are approaching 100 years old. The battlefields have returned to silence. Vegetation has reclaimed the caves where men fought and died. The guns are rusted. The bunkers are crumbling. On Iwo Jima, the tunnels have largely collapsed. On Peleliu, jungle growth has erased most evidence of the fighting. Guadalcanal is now an independent nation where few remember the battles that raged there 8 decades ago, but the institution those men built endures. The training philosophy they perfected still shapes Marines today. Recruits at Paris Island and San Diego still memorize the rifleman's creed. They still qualify at 500 yards with iron sights. They still learn that every Marine is a rifleman first, regardless of their military occupation or specialty. The amphibious doctrine those pre-war planners developed remains the foundation of American power projection. The spirit they demonstrated, the willingness to close with the enemy and destroy him regardless of cost, remains the defining characteristic of the Corps. Every Marine learns the history of Guadalcanal and Tarawa, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. They learn the names Edson and Puller and Basilone. They learn what the men who came before them accomplished and what it cost. This is not mere tradition. It is the transmission of a warrior culture across generations, the continuation of a legacy written in blood on islands most Americans have never heard of. New Marines are taught that they are inheriting something, joining a lineage that stretches back to the Revolutionary War and forward into whatever conflicts await. The Japanese forces who fought the Marines learned to respect them through catastrophic battlefield education. The contempt that sent Ichiki's men charging into the machine guns at Alligator Creek gave way to the sophisticated defensive tactics of Kuribayashi at Iwo Jima. Japanese commanders learned that banzai charges, however spiritually satisfying, accomplished nothing except the destruction of their own forces. They learned that Americans would not break and run. They learned that the Marines in particular would keep coming, absorbing casualties that would have stopped other forces, until the position was taken and the enemy destroyed. General Holland Smith wrote after the war that Iwo Jima represented the classic amphibious assault of recorded history, a judgment that reflected both pride and pain. He understood what Iwo Jima meant, not just as a battle won, but as a symbol of what Marines were capable of achieving when the stakes could not be higher. Secretary Forrestal had been right. The flag that Rosenthal photographed would ensure a Marine Corps for generations to come. That flag still inspires Marines today. That legacy still stands. If you found this story compelling, subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories from the Second World War. Leave a comment below telling us what aspect of the Pacific War you would like to learn more about. Our community includes veterans, historians, and enthusiasts from around the world, united by a commitment to remembering the sacrifices made by ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.